Good evening. My name is Darryl Robert Schoon, and I'd like to welcome you to another show of Dollars and Cents. On previous shows, I took a very broad view of the history of capitalism, or modern banking, which is what I call it. The two are not, they're indistinguishable. And we started with the formation of the Bank of England in 1695, the first central bank that would issue debt-based money, which is the only kind of money in existence today. Previous to the Bank of England, all money was savings-based, gold or silver. It had positive value. What people don't understand is that those pieces of paper you're holding are all debt-based. And this is true for every country in the world. It's never been this way before. If every debt got paid off, all that money would disappear. All that money would disappear. And I know you don't know it, and I know there's a lot you don't know. And it's not because you're dumb or ignorant, though you may be. It's because they've lied to us, they've held the secrets from us, because by their oppression, they've become fabulously wealthy and in control of much of our lives. And today, I'm going to approach this subject from a very different angle than I have in the past. Before I gave you the macro view, I've talked about the events, of the historical events, World War II, the Federal Reserve, the gold disappearing from the United States, things like that. And this time, I'm going to approach it from another angle, the angle of personalities, people who played a role in what is transpiring and what is affecting us today. There are four individuals I am going to focus on. The first you haven't heard of, very few of you've heard about him. I'm sure some of them in the audience may have heard, but very, very few. And the second is more well known, and the last two are very well known. The last two are Ben Bernanke, the current chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank. The person before that I'm going to talk about is Alan Greenspan. The person before that, which I'm going to talk about today, is Paul Volcker, past chairman of the Fed and Undersecretary of the Treasury of the United States. And I'm going to lead off, however, talking about a person I doubt if many of you know. And that in itself is a tragedy, because this man holds a key, and he saw before anybody saw what was about to happen and what is happening to us today. This man's name is John Exter. John was going to college during the Great Depression, and he went to Harvard starting in 1938. His desire was to find out for himself what lay at the root of this tremendous economic devastation in which he had spent his youth. Exter grew up, I'm sure he made the transition. I'm sure, probably a teenager during the 1920s, the roaring 20s, where everything was great. And then in 1929, the stock market just crashed, bringing and sending the world into what was known then, what we now know as the Great Depression, an unprecedented collapse of the economic system. Now, he went to Harvard, 1938, very smart man. And when he emerged a few years later, Exter had pretty much come to the conclusion on his own thinking of what had happened, what had caused the greatest deflationary collapse, the greatest collapse of capitalism since the British put this system into motion in 1695. Exter left Harvard and became a central banker. Now, central bankers are at the core of the present-day financial system. The Bank of England was a central bank, and for years was the only major central bank in the world. The bankers then moved, as I talked about previously, they transported this English central bank of debt-based money to the United States in 1913 as England was failing, and because its economy could no longer produce enough imperialistic wealth. They had taken over India, drained India of its wealth, and they couldn't take over China, and they couldn't take over Russia, and they couldn't take over the rest of the world. But the English Empire was the largest empire since Rome at this time. So what the bankers did, because you always have to keep the Ponzi scheme expanding. You always have to keep the pool of debt and loans expanding. You have to keep the economy expanding to pay off. Now why? To pay off all the debts that have already been set in motion. If you don't, it's like a Ponzi scheme, all right? Bernard Madoff, when his Ponzi scheme slowed down, and it did, that's when Bernie got in trouble. And the same thing with capitalism. They have to keep the pile of loans expanding. They have to keep the flow of credit and payments growing to pay off that compounding interest that they've already set in motion. So what they did was they took this system in the Bank of England and brought it to the United States in 1913, and we have another chapter. Now, I've gone over this before, but I want to talk about John Exter. I want to talk about certain personalities that I think will shed more light on really why and where we are today. When John Exter left college, he had pretty much come to his conclusions that it was a collapse of leveraged credit, a huge amount of credit made available by central banking on debt-based money. When it finally collapsed, it dropped the world into a deflationary collapse, the likes of which it had never seen before. And it took a war that just absolutely cleaned off the slate, destroyed the ability to produce goods, and finally in World War II they started growing again. Well, Exter by this time had become a central banker. He was at the New York Fed, and I met this man, and it's really a tragedy that very little is known about him. I even this afternoon went up on Wikipedia to see if there was an entrance about it, some notation, and there was nothing about John Exter. I had run across the name in the a few years ago, probably 7, 8 years ago, 9 years ago maybe, and I saw his name mentioned, and it was mentioned by somebody who said he had attended a lecture that Exter had given. Exter never wrote a book, and so he described what the lecture was, and I wanted to find out more about this person, and I could find nothing on him. And then I found an interview that Franklin Saunders gave about John Exter. And Franklin had met this man. And Saunders had been imprisoned by the United States government. He was a coin dealer in Tennessee. And he knew the difference between money and coins were real money. So there shouldn't be any sales tax on money, on the transfer of money. He only dealt in coins, silver coins, gold coins. This was U.S. currency, all right? Now, so what happened is the feds came down, threw him to the floor. You know, the ATF agents came in and they threw him in jail. Now, Franklin had met John Exter in New York. Franklin, he was a coin dealer, but he was very serious about money. And he had attended the meetings of the Committee for Monetary Reform and Education, CMRE. A very little known group, but these people who go to the CMRE are serious scholars. These are not your run-of-the-mill guys. This is not an investment forum. This is not ways to make money off of gold and silver. This is a group of people that's been meeting in New York for decades on monetary reform. And he had met John Exter there. And Franklin was just a guy, a young man from Tennessee who was interested in money. Exter was a central banker. He had worked he had been with Chase Manhattan. He was in the high echelons of government. And Franklin said that when he was arrested by the government, he asked Exter to come and testify. And Exter did. Man, on his own dime, went down to Tennessee, testified at Franklin's trial on what Franklin was doing and what he was up to. But the United States government, they just made it, they just dismissed everything. And Franklin did go to prison for this. And now he's out. And if you're interested in silver, his website is The Money Changer. Franklin Saunders, an extraordinary human being. He's paid the price for being honest and forthright. Well, John Exter not only is a man of great compassion and integrity, he was a man of foresight. And even though he worked as a central banker as a Fed and worked in commercial banking at Chase Manhattan, I believe, he could see that where we had gone ended up in the 1930s, we were headed there once again. We had done nothing. We had really done nothing significant to prevent another repeat of the Great Depression. And Exter started saying that we were going to have another deflationary collapse on the level of the Great Depression, that it was inevitable. Now, I mentioned his name at a talk I was giving, I think it was in Los Angeles, and my good friend Dr. Antal Fekete was there from Hungary. And when I mentioned Exter's name, Professor Fekete stood up and he said he knew Exter. I was quite taken aback. I mean, this man who was only a legend in my mind, who died in 1996, Professor Fekete stood up and he said, yes. And he said, do you know why Exter was pro-gold? And I said, no. He said, because during the 1950s, he was at the New York Fed in charge of gold and silver transactions. And that's when he saw all the gold leaving the U.S. Treasury. The outflow of gold was so phenomenal. He knew then that this was going to come to no good for the United States. In 1954, the United States prohibited any public, after that they stopped all public audits of its gold reserves. We don't know how much gold we have. We know that it's a lot less than we ever had before. We don't know if those numbers are fudged. They have things called deep storage. Never existed before. Deep storage. I mean, it's sort of a joke in the gold and silver community that deep storage means the storage that's longer your arm length, that when you reach down you can't find it, but it's there. All right? Just last week, Congressman Ron Paul asked the Treasury to do an audit of its gold. And they produced something. He said, oh no, I've seen it. But they won't do it. And Congress is now going to ask, at least Ron Paul is, going to ask the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury to give an accounting. All right? It remains to be seen whether this is going to be true or not, because much has happened with that gold that we don't know about and they don't want us to know about. But what happened is that John Exter saw this huge outflow of gold, and he put something together that is, if you go up on the web, it's easy to find. It's called Exter's Inverse Pyramid. And I want to show you what it is. This is a copy of the Exter's Inverse Pyramid. And you notice that it's broader at the top and it goes down to the bottom. What Exter said was this: in a deflationary collapse, when push comes to shove, money is going to start, and wealth and assets are going to flow downwards. They're going to move quickly to the bottom, which is gold. Gold is the only thing of any real value. Everything else has value, but it can't be sold easily. And that's what the pyramid represents. Now, at the top of the pyramid, you have a small business. So in terms, when everybody's rushing for the exit, the small businesses are going to have more trouble selling their business than anyone else, because it's a small business. Not much is known about it. All right? You may have a printing business or a graphics business or a flower business, and when push comes to shove, you'll put your business up for sale, there'll be no takers. The next one down is real estate. And I think you already know the trouble that real estate is in now. All right? Exter had it at number 2, and it's already in trouble. All right? Number 3, diamonds and gemstones. Illiquid. It's getting illiquid. Number 4, over-the-counter stocks. They're still selling, but we haven't hit that exit sign yet. When push comes to shove, these over-the-counter stocks, the small cap stocks, are going to be hard to move. Commodities, muni bonds. Muni bonds are already in trouble. Last year, Meredith Whitney issued a call, and she said that most of these municipal bonds are going to be defaulting. All right? We saw an outflow of billions of dollars, a sustained outflow over months from the muni bond field. All right? We're already in motion. What Exter warned about in the 60s is now in motion. When I started talking about Exter and writing about him, somebody wrote me a letter, and they sent me the obituary that he had died in 1996 in New York. And I read the obituary. It mentioned nothing about his contribution to economic thought. Nothing about the pyramid. And for those who are aware of his life, this was a man who was so far ahead of the game. He died before what he saw was going to happen. It's happening today. We could call this Exter's collapse. This really is the collapse he predicted. And then after muni bonds, we have corporate bonds, government bonds, treasury bills, Federal Reserve notes, which is paper money, and at the bottom of the pyramid, this green, it's gold. It's gold. Exter saw in the late 1950s, 60s, because of his work at the Fed, that all the gold was leaving the United States, much of our gold was leaving, and that the United States would pay dearly for this. All right? In the last resort, when paper money is losing value, gold is what is the absolute opposite of paper money. This is what the central bank of the Bank of England in 1695 set to destroy. They substituted gold and silver coin with their paperback debt-based money. All right? And how they kept this thing going was that the paper that you held could always be transferred, could always be convertible. It was convertible to gold and silver. All right? So even though they could print much more paper money and charge interest on it, the thing that kept the fraud going, the thing that gave the fraud legs, was that paper money was technically always convertible to gold and silver. And in England you could do so. But in 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stopped it. The act in 1933 made it illegal for U.S. citizens to own gold. For the first time. I mean, this was robbery. This is truly highway robbery. All right? Now, what happened is citizens couldn't own gold until probably, I think, in the 1970s, when they had figured they'd swept it under the rug. They'd finally dismissed gold. All right? But gold was used still by all central banks to settle currency imbalances that came as a result of trade or war. All right? Now, what happened is Exter saw all the gold leaving the Treasury in the 1950s. This made Exter believe and become very much a believer in the value of gold. Well, this is where it intersects the name of the next person that we're going to talk about, Paul Volcker. Paul Volcker was, like Exter, a central banker. But Volcker was very much an inside boy. All right? Now, our memories of Volcker are that he stood up with great courage when Jimmy Carter appointed him chairman of the Fed, when inflation was just running rampant in the United States, and Volcker stepped up to the plate, and he raised interest rates to 21%. Now, do you know what would happen if they raised interest rates to 21% today? This economy cannot even survive now at 0.25 or 0.00. We are running close at zero. This is what the government is on life support. Our economy is on life support. All right? But Volcker, people remember, oh, Paul Volcker, he was the man with the cojones who stood up against all the rage of the New York Republicans, all the rage of the Democrats, all the rage of the country, appointed by Jimmy Carter to bring inflation under control. He raised overnight rates to 21%, the prime rate went to 23.5%, and killed inflation, knocked it back down, and everything was good again. What people don't know about Paul Volcker, he played a critical role in the inflation in the first place. 1969 to 1974, Paul Volcker was Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Monetary Affairs. Volcker played an important role in the decisions leading to the U.S. suspension of gold convertibility in 1971, which resulted in the collapse of Bretton Woods, the global monetary system up until that time. I'd like to read something from an article I wrote. There was subtitled this section, The War on Gold. And I want to lead off with a quote from Franz Lips's book, The Gold Wars. Franz Lips was a Swiss gold banker, all right? And he knew and he saw what was going on. Franz Lips died a few years ago. He was going to speak at GATA, the organization that has publicized the government manipulation of gold markets, and he died that year in a car wreck. There are rumors that he was put under. He knew far too much about what was going on and what had happened. In his youth, Volcker had been he had created the Rothschilds Bank in Zurich. All right? A friend of mine handled much of the gold trade between Canada and Europe at that time, and he said the person who sat opposite on him was Franz Lips. All right? Franz Lips wrote this little book he called The War on Gold, and this is what he said. The IMF explicitly states in its Articles of Agreement that member countries are prohibited from tying their currencies to gold. IMF, I mean, this is the International Organization for International, Monetary Stability, prohibits countries from tying their currencies to gold. This is the central bankers. Now, curiously, Lips had earlier been an agent for the infamous Rothschilds banking family. In 1968, he was co-founder and managing director of Rothschilds Bank AG Zurich, As such, Lips had an insight into the world of gold that few had, and some believe it would later cost him his life. One story in Gold Wars is of a particular interest as it involves John Exter, the extraordinary central banker, formerly vice president in charge of international banking and gold and silver operations at the New York Federal Reserve, and Paul Volcker, later Fed chairman and erroneously believed by many to be a hero. Exter's story shows Volcker in an entirely different light, not as a hero, but as the one responsible for the removal of gold from the monetary system. Volcker, according to Exter, played a central role in the decision to do so. In Franz Lipp's book, Gold Wars, pages 76 to 77, John Exter tells Ferdinand Lips how the decision to demonetize gold was made. Quote, on August 10th, 1971, a group of bankers, economists, and monetary experts held an informal meeting to discuss the monetary crisis. Around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, a big car rolled up with Paul Volcker in it. He was then Undersecretary of the Treasury for Monetary Affairs. We discussed various possible solutions. As you would expect, I was for tight money, raising interest rates, and that was overwhelmingly rejected. As for raising the gold price, as I suggested, Volcker said it made sense, but he didn't think he could get it through Congress. At one point, Volcker turned to me and asked what I would do. I told him that since he wouldn't raise interest rates and wouldn't raise the price of gold, he had only one option. He'd have to close the gold window. 5 days later, Nixon closed the gold window. This is what actually happened. 9 years after Volcker did this, he was forced to raise interest rates, which he refused to do in 1971, and keep the gold standard. He chickened out. He was later called in to put out the fire that he himself lit by Jimmy Carter, and he did so. People see Volcker as a hero. He was, in a way. He had the courage to do something that few would do. But history does not remind us that it was Volcker himself who lit the flame that 9 years later would turn into uncontrollable inflation in the U.S. economy when our currency was no longer anchored to gold. So what we're seeing here is two central bankers. One, John Exter, a man of integrity and courage, who saw what was happening, who sounded the alarm, and no one listened. And another person, he has integrity, but though he's a paper boy at heart. Volcker was much more an inside man. He moved between Wall Street and the Federal Reserve, between Treasury and the Federal Reserve throughout his long career, and today Volcker is still an advisor to the President of the United States, Barack Obama. And if you wonder why our system is still as corrupt as it is, and I'm not saying Volcker is responsible for the corruption, but he certainly played a central role in central banking's corruption of our money. Volcker was known to have said, after he ratcheted up interest rates and brought down the price of gold from $850, he is known to have said, his one regret is that we didn't learn to manage gold earlier. Managing gold is like fixing the thermometer. Gold is the only real thermometer of economic and monetary distress. Paul Volcker and the other two people I'm going to talk about later, Alan Greenspan and Ben Bernanke, were all on the side of manipulating the system so the banking system, which eats away productivity, which indebts humanity, could survive. That man is still today in the U.S. government, as all the rest of them are, to a greater or lesser degree. I mean, Greenspan was tossed out, and we'll talk about next time in the program what happened on his watch and the truth about Alan Greenspan and the Federal Reserve and why we are in the trouble we're in today. There's a lot people don't know. There was a lot that has been hidden, but it is there. And I would hope that somehow some of you would begin to think in ways differently about why we're here today. Here's a hint. It ain't the Mexicans. Darryl Robert Schoon.